Today's scripture reading is definitely one of the most baffling ones that we hear in the Gospels. Jesus, who has spent his ministry healing the blind, healing the lame, is here heard saying, "Pluck out your eyes, cut off your hands, cut off your feet, maim yourself." It's a bizarre, bizarre thing for him to say. Better to live with just one eye than to end up in Gehenna, which is his name for hell. Gehenna was actually a real place. It was a valley south of Jerusalem where in the old days when the pagans lived in that area, they would throw their children into bonfires, dedicating them to their pagan gods. So the Jews considered Gehenna to be the worst possible punishment, the worst possible place one could end up. A fire that's unquenchable and where the worm never dies. This is the kind of imagery that gives most Christians the creeps, right? We don't want to hear Jesus saying stuff like this because Jesus is the Prince of Peace. He's the one who loves everyone, who wants to encourage us to love everyone else. So how can he be talking about plucking out eyes and burning in Gehenna? What possible wisdom can there be in any of this? Well, let's step back a moment here. We know that the Bible presents Jesus as a healer, and the people who wrote this text definitely believed that Jesus was a healer, that he had spent his ministry just walking from town to town to town healing people. So the idea that Jesus would suggest that anybody get maimed, of course, was impossible. And think of his disciples, the people he spoke these words to. Many of them were killed for their faith. Some were crucified, others were stoned to death. They were willing to give up their bodies and their life for this faith. But, in the images that we have of the disciples, none of them look like this. None of them walk around with eye patches. Christians are known for having crosses around their neck, not wearing eye patches because they plucked out their eyes because they felt a bit of lust or some sort of wayward thought. That's not the way Christians have become known, and for good reason, because Jesus was speaking metaphorically. And the clue to what Jesus means by this metaphor of saying, pluck out your eyes and cut off your hands and feet, is in his description of Gehenna. It's a place of unquenchable fire where the fire never dies, it keeps burning and burning and burning, and the worm never tires of eating. Jesus is suggesting that if you suffer from a compulsion that is all-consuming, you are already in Gehenna. Unquenchable desires can make it feel like our eye or our feet or our hands are in complete control of our bodies and minds. Our eyes demand to see porn on the internet, not just a little bit every once in a while, but every single day. Or our hand keeps reaching for the bottle or the syringe. We wake up in the middle of the night desperate for another fix. Our desires, which never seem to be satisfied, have taken control of our life. If that happens to you, it may have happened to you, or you may know someone that it's happened to. Christ is saying you'd be better off cutting out that compulsion than to allow it to destroy your life. Because we've all known people who have lost it all to an addiction or a compulsion. Right? Mortgages lost, families lost, no longer able to talk to brothers and sisters, wives and children estranged because of addictions and compulsions which completely took over. It happens. Most families have a few people in it. You may have gone through this yourself. Addictions that can throw your life into the fire long before death comes. If that happens, Christ is saying, if you're in that situation, you need to make a choice and make it right now. So how do we fix ourselves? Well, for the past century or so, our society's answer has been to criminalize the supply of whatever is addictive and to morally condemn those who get addicted. It's as though we misread the Bible and we heard Christ saying, if you see someone sinning with their eye, go out and pull out their eye. That's not what he said, but that seems to be what we've been doing. In Canada, heroin and marijuana were outlawed in 1923. In the 1920s, the same approach of outlawing the supply was applied to alcohol in the United States. That was the start of prohibition. Sales of booze were prohibited to end alcoholism, which had become a big problem. In the 1960s, new drugs like LSD, acid, were outlawed, followed in the 1970s with laws against drugs like ecstasy. And all along the way, the people who used these drugs were stigmatized as people with poor willpower or worse. But a strange thing happened as those drugs were banned. They got stronger. When the Americans banned the sale of beer and alcohol in the 1920s, suddenly there was big business to be had for Canadians who could smuggle booze over the border. But it was too hard to get big crates of wine and beer over the border in those boats that crossed the Great Lakes and were loaded up onto trucks. So they decided to do something that was more concentrated. They shipped over hard liquor instead. The strength of booze during the 1920s and 30s, thanks to Prohibition, rose by 150%. Our taste for hard liquor comes out of Prohibition because alcohol got stronger in its potency because it had been banned. Similarly, when Ronald Reagan declared a war on drugs in the 1980s, the Drug Enforcement Agency sent out planes to find the fields where marijuana was being grown. So the marijuana dealers didn't want to give up. So what they did was they moved their crops inside to create what became known as grow-ops, houses and warehouses full of marijuana plants underneath lights and grown hydroponically. But of course, a house isn't as big as a field, so they had to increase the potency of the marijuana plants to be able to keep up with demand. So weed actually became 161% more potent between 1990 and the year 2017, or 2007 rather. This is called the iron law of prohibition. Banning a substance just makes it stronger. And this same process has actually been at work over the last 2 years during the pandemic. We've seen this actually just come to fruition. Because what happened was, when the borders were closed, the supply of heroin dwindled for those who were dealing heroin up here in Canada. With a shortage of heroin coming over the American border, the dealers didn't give up. Instead, what they did was they decided to supplement the dwindling supply of heroin with fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid. And now the entire supply of heroin is poisoned with fentanyl, which is causing an absolute epidemic of overdoses. Because fentanyl is much more potent than heroin. And this has had absolutely tragic consequences. Here's a graph that was released this month showing the rate of overdoses in Ontario before and during the pandemic. That red line where it says lockdown is where the lockdown began in March, and you can see the overdose deaths just take off. The graph just goes straight up. In Toronto, overdose deaths rose by a whopping 78% in the space of a year because of the pandemic. 520 people have died of overdoses in just 2020 in Toronto. Banning drugs to prevent addiction has not worked. Prohibition didn't end alcoholism, and the war on drugs did not end marijuana use or the consumption of heroin. Approximately 1 in 5 Canadians will be addicted to drugs or alcohol at some point in their lifetime. Criminalizing users and their supply has not changed demand, it's only made the drugs and alcohol stronger. And the price of this failed strategy has been paid in lives lost to alcoholism and drug overdoses. When Jesus spoke of unquenchable desires, which he did not suggest that someone else pluck out your eye or someone else cut off your hand or foot. Instead, he said, we have to make that choice for ourselves. He says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. He's talking to the person who has the problem, not the people around them. If it feels like our lives are out of control, with desires that seem to have a mind on their own, then we need to make a choice. We need to discard that part of ourselves before it destroys our entire life. But note how Jesus phrases this. He doesn't say, pluck out both of your eyes, or chop off both of your hands or both of your feet. He says, pluck out one eye. Leave the other one. Chop off one foot. Chop off one hand. These words are well chosen. Jesus is not condemning the entire person. If he were, he might say, pluck out both your eyes. But he's saying, no, actually, there's another half of you that still has life, that still has promise. Don't give up. That thing which has got you in its grips isn't all of you. It's just a part of you, a part that can be discarded, and you will survive, and you will be better. That other part, the good eye, the good hand, the good foot, it can lead you back to a path of normalcy and get you away from that hell that you were living in. Jesus is not giving up on the person who gets addicted to drugs or porn or gambling. He's saying you can regain your balance, even if it means chopping off that part of you that has become addicted. We may object to the graphic nature of these metaphors. They're gruesome. But if you've ever known someone who's gone through withdrawal, they're entirely appropriate. If you try to go cold turkey or give up alcohol or drugs, it feels like someone's trying to tear off your arm. It feels like something which is absolutely essential to your being, your whole life, that has structured your entire life. Someone is trying to tear that off. It's visceral. There's nothing easy about going through withdrawal, and it's very easy to draw back and say, I can't stand it. I don't want to go through that anymore. It's a whole body feeling. It's not just an idea. So when Jesus says, chop it off, he's implying it's going to hurt. And it will. But your survival may depend on it. We've come a long way in the last 2,000 years, and we know a lot more about the scientific basis of addiction. It's an imbalance in the brain's chemicals, an excess of pleasure and reward-inducing neurotransmitters. Telling people to stop, you should just give that up, doesn't get you very far. It's no match for what's going on in their heads. And cutting off the supply doesn't work either. That simply drives the whole enterprise underground, where the profits are even higher and the supply becomes more dangerous, as we've seen with heroin and fentanyl. So what should be done? Well, recently the Toronto Public Board of Health sent round a survey asking Torontonians if they would consider Toronto Public Health's idea of asking the federal government to decriminalize all drugs used for personal use in Toronto. The city's health experts have reached the conclusion that addiction is a medical issue, not a moral one or a criminal one. They're hoping to ask the federal government to decriminalize drugs for personal use, like heroin, since the war on drugs has failed and too many people are getting addicted and dying. This approach, of course, is controversial. Many people will say, well, won't that just lead more people to get addicted if they don't have to worry about getting arrested? But you know, this approach has been tried in other countries. In the late 1990s, fully 1% of all people in Portugal were addicted to heroin. It was tearing the society apart. Families were falling apart, jobs were being ruined because people were so addicted to heroin that they couldn't function. And it just gripped the entire country. So they decided to take a radical step. They decided to decriminalize all drugs. And instead of spending money on chasing down the dealers and chasing down the users, they poured money into medical and psychological help for people who are addicted. If you were found with heroin, you immediately had to have a meeting with some medical health professionals to help you with your habit. You weren't thrown into jail, you weren't fined, but you were given help. And the result was a dramatic drop in addiction rates. Within just a few years, addiction rates had fallen by 3/4. The same was true for overdose deaths. Here in Toronto, we haven't gone that far. We have 9 safe injection sites in Toronto, and they're all downtown. That's a place where you can go in, if you're a heroin user, and sit down with a nurse with you, and you can inject your dose, and if you have an overdose, a nurse is there with all the medical equipment and drugs needed to help you get through your overdose so you don't die. It may seem that this kind of clinic would just perpetuate the problem of allowing drug addicts to continue injecting. But in fact, what all sorts of studies have found, because this approach is used in many countries, is that the heroin user and the nurse often develop a relationship of trust. She's there to save that person's life should anything go wrong. And when the user comes in every day, they get to know each other and they get to have conversations about, there are ways of getting off heroin. There are programs you could sign up for. And because it's coming from someone who they trust with their life, literally, lots of people start to transition out of heroin into methadone programs and other programs which lead away from addiction. Study after study has shown that this kind of sympathetic relationship becomes the on-ramp to effective treatment. Trust and help are more effective than fear and prohibition. It's human nature. It's a very difficult decision to give up on an addiction. These dependencies can seem as critical to you as your eyes, your hands, or your feet. And no one can force you to make that decision. You have to make that decision for yourself. But succeeding is a lot easier if you have help. At the end of today's reading, Jesus throws in yet another metaphor, which seems to come completely out of left field, where he starts talking about his disciples as though they're made of salt. How can the salt work if it's lost its flavor? It seems like, why is he talking about salt? What point is there in saying, hey, you disciples, you should taste good like salt. You should be spicy like salt. You'll make the meal better. It doesn't seem to make any sense. But it's a metaphor, of course, and it's a metaphor that's a little bit lost on us, but the people of Portugal can help us with this. In Portugal, on Christmas Eve, it is normal for people to have salted cod for dinner. And salted cod, which you may have seen in places like the St. Lawrence Market or sometimes in No Frills, salted cod looks like this. It's just a big piece of cod which is flayed, put in the sun, dried out with some salt, and then people cook it and bring it back to life after having soaked the salt out of it. Salted cod is a way of preserving the fish from rotting, right? Back in Christ's day, they didn't have refrigerators. There was no place to put the fresh fish once you caught it. You couldn't just keep it, on your table in the kitchen for 3 days and eat it 3 days later. You either ate it that day or you had to find a way to preserve it. They preserved it by pouring salt all over it. So when Jesus asks people like us to be salt, he's saying, don't let people fall into corruption and rot. Don't let people go bad. Salt preserves the good. And so Jesus is saying, be like salt. Preserve what is good. We're not called to pluck out sinners' eyes or chop off their hands or feet. Instead, when they've decided to make a change in their lives, help them. Help them to preserve the good that is still inside them. When we condemn and judge, we become like salt that's lost its flavor. So let's choose to be good salt, preservers of what is good. For every soul on this earth is a child of God, and none should suffer in the fires of addiction. Let us help them discard what hurts them so they can live whole and thriving lives. That is the path of love. Amen.